Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is McKenna, and I am a freelance writer with Reuters, Thomson Reuters News Service. I'm here with Thomas Bass, who is a English and journalism professor at State University of New York at Albany. He has written 5 books and contributed to The New Yorker, Wired, Smithsonian, The New York Times, and other publications. His most recent book is The Spy Who Loved Us. It is published by Public Affairs Books, a member of the Perseus Books Group, and movie rights to several of his books have been sold to various film companies, including Focus Features and BBC Films. The book is about Vietnam journalist spy Pham Xuân An, and it has been released to rave reviews by noted spy novelist John le Carré and many others associated with the Vietnam War, including Daniel Ellsberg, Seymour Hersh, Morley Safer, Ted Koppel, and Seymour Topping, the last few being war reporters. Welcome, Thomas, to Meet the Author.
Very good to be here.
And thank you for joining us to discuss your book about An. We'll refer to him as An from here on out, like a good journalist, using the last, only the last name, no courtesy titles unless you work for the New York Times. This is your second book about Vietnam. The first was Vietnam America, about Amerasian children from the war. In your foreword, you talk about our love affair with Vietnam. And I'd like to start by asking how you became so interested in writing about Vietnam.
Well, Holly, I'm of a certain age, as they say, and I was born in 1951. So my entire childhood was defined by that prolonged war in Southeast Asia, which lasted for 30 years. From 1945 to 1975, there was war in Vietnam. So, of course, for someone who comes of age during the Vietnam era, it was certainly a formative part of my life. I did not fight in the Vietnam War. I was slightly too young. I had too many deferments and a high number eventually. But anyway, so Vietnam was always in my mind. I made my first trip to Vietnam in 1992. That was to write the book Vietnam America that you mentioned, about Amerasian children of American soldiers who were airlifted into the United States. And it was on that trip to Vietnam in 1992 that I first met Pham Xuân An, the hero of The Spy Who Loved Us. And he welcomed me for an afternoon's conversation into his villa, and proved to be a charming and amazing man. And so I joined a long line of people who wanted to tell his story, including that list of journalists you just read. Neil Sheehan and Halberstam and Arnett and all of these people were utterly amazed when they learned that Pham Xuân An had been a spy. He was the main political correspondent for Time magazine during the Vietnam War. He was on the masthead of Time magazine. There were only about 32 reporters on the masthead of Time magazine. So he was their main political correspondent, a trusted journalist, thought to be a great lover of the United States, thought to be a supporter of the United States policy in fighting the Vietnam War. And then to everyone's utter amazement, it was revealed after the war that he had in fact been a spy for the North Vietnamese communists. And not just a spy, but their most important spy, the preeminent number one spy.
The top spy. You said he got 16 medals for his work in the war.
Yes, yeah.
And that was just amazing to me that he was able to live those double lives, really, almost a triple life, because he was also helping the CIA too at some point. So he had a lot of lives. Yeah, and he also did write for Reuters, which was fun to read. He started out with Reuters, and then they had kind of a little bit of a falling out, and then he moved over to Time. But he helped a lot of reporters with information. He was, as you said, the go-to man. When somebody showed up in Saigon for information, reporters for information for the first time, everyone's like, you got to go talk to An. He's the guy. He knows everything. And now we know why he knows everything, because he was so connected to so many different people and situations. So.
Right. He began he began his career as a journalist. The first job he had with a Western news agency was with Reuters, which you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And you learn how to write a certain kind of journalism when you work for Reuters, as you well know. It's terse, to the point. You have to jump on the story. They want you to be the first to break the story. No background, no filler, no adjectives, adverbs, just the news, and get it in first. So he certainly learned how to become. Well, he was also trained. He was trained in the United States. The communists had sent him to the United States to study journalism, and that showed amazing foresight on their part, that they would actually pluck an obscure postal clerk out of the post office and buy him 4 suits of clothing and send him to study journalism at Orange Coast Community College
In
California, because they knew that after the first Indochina War, the war against the French, they knew that there would be a second Indochina War against the United States, and that they needed someone who was knowledgeable about the United States. And so Pham Son studies journalism at Orange Coast Community College. He works for the Orange Coast College newspaper. But it's when he goes back to Vietnam and gets that first job with Reuters that he really begins to learn how to write that telegraphic Western news style, which, for all I know, you're still practicing.
A little bit more freedom in terms of, especially with features. They like that you can be a little bit, certainly more embellishing, a little bit more descriptive. And I personally like to write more of those stories than the news stories. I do a lot of those too, but it's fun to be able to just. How did you get information about him and his life? Other than you met him too and you interviewed him, but there was many things that he wasn't always telling you, or.
Well, every spy, Holly, has a cover. They have a story that they tell, and Pham Son's story was that he loved the United States, he loved Western journalism, he loved our democracy and freedom, and he would talk. The reason that every journalist would stop and visit him when they first arrived in South Vietnam was that he could talk for hours on end. And this wonderfully rich broth of history. I mean, he would take you back through Vietnam's 5,000 years of history, and he could recite poetry, stories, fill you in on all of the gossip. He knew everybody, and he knew and he knew everything that they were doing, and everything that compromised them, and all of the graft and corruption, which was, of course, rampant. The client government that the United States had installed in South Vietnam was corrupt from top to bottom. And Pham Son would fill you in on all of these things. So anyway, he developed this method of talking nonstop. And so whenever I would go to see him, and eventually I recorded these conversations, 60 hours of tape-recorded conversations, he would talk at tremendous length about his life. And it turned out, as I listened to these stories over and over again, sometimes I would ask him the same question a dozen times. And it was only one out of those dozen times that there would be a slightly different answer. For example, only once did he reveal that he'd actually fired a shot at the French when he was being trained by the communists to fight in the first Indochina War. He was a platoon leader. And out of the dozen times I asked him that question, only once did he reveal that he'd actually led his platoon in action and shot at the French. That is not something that he wanted to get out. And I only learned that, in that case, by listening to that conversation a dozen times.
Yeah, I was very confused at times, thinking, was he a soldier? Was he really engaged? And that's exactly what you're talking about. And his spy work, like who was he working for? Because he had so many different tales going on at the same time.
Well, the French, the book has been translated into French, and they can't use the spy who loved us, because who was the us? The us is America, so they have to change the title. And the French are calling it The Man with Four Faces.
Okay.
And the four faces have to do with the fact that he was trained in intelligence primarily by the CIA, by his encounter with Edward Lansdale. But he was also one of the founders of the South Vietnamese intelligence organization. And he also worked for the French. So he was trained by the Deuxième Bureau, the French intelligence services. And then, of course, his primary allegiance, and not his training, because they didn't know anything, but his primary allegiance was to North Vietnamese intelligence. And so you have these four intelligence agencies, and of course, he played them all off against each other, and led everyone to believe that he was actually a CIA agent, when in fact he was never a CIA agent, and led everyone to believe that he was a South Vietnamese intelligence agent, when in fact he was a North Vietnamese intelligence agent.
He really has five faces, because if you throw in the journalist, but that was a good cover that he had, because he had a lot of access. You mentioned in the book that they could go anywhere at night, they could park anywhere, because they had a press pass. It was like they were like they had the most freedom of everybody, besides maybe the military, in Vietnam. On several occasions, you said you wanted to abandon the project. Why is that? It seems like such a great story. You had access to the top banana, the main source, which is sometimes reporters can't do that, so they have to create stories from what other people say about this person. But why did you want to do that?
Well, I'll tell a story about that.
Okay, of course. Stories.
So The Spy Who Loved Us. It comes out first as an article in the New Yorker magazine. And the New Yorker has this famous fact-checking department. And my fact-checker was a recent graduate from the Columbia School of Journalism, former reporter for the Los Angeles Times. She reported, and I reported, that Pham Son An had won 4 military medals.
Okay.
This was wrong. The New Yorker was wrong. I was wrong. He'd actually won 16 military medals. Now, there was a reason why he didn't want to tell me about all those military medals, because as I only later learned, each one of those military medals, or most of them, were tied to specific military actions where the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, had remarkably managed to beat the United States military. Here you have a barefoot army running around.
Living in tunnels.
Living underground, barefoot, and they manage time and again to inflict remarkable damage on the U.S. military and to avoid being captured. How did they do this? What was their secret weapon? How were they pulling this off? And their secret weapon turned out to be Pham Son An. The advanced information that he leaked to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, for instance, allowed them to escape when Richard Nixon invaded Cambodia, intending to capture the North Vietnamese military campaign headquarters. They were gone. They weren't there. What happened? Why weren't they there? They'd received an advance tip from Pham Son An. So time and again, these 16 military medals, they're tied to specific military actions where he was the prime, as I say, the secret weapon.
I wanted to ask you, you talked about the Vietnamese style, and you say that you've written the book in that way. In conversation, you're saying they throw, it's like the kitchen sink. They've got everything going there. Is that what the Vietnamese style in writing is as well? That you've kind of got a little smattering of it all there?
Yes.
I was trying to draw from that, because I don't know what the Vietnamese writing style is. Obviously, An learned the Western style of journalism, so he wasn't doing that. But in his person, it sounds like he.
Well, this book is full of it's full of jokes and stories and red herrings and tangents, and so it has all of those things. It has all of those elements thrown into it, as well as descriptions of Saigon and Vietnam and the countryside. It's a gorgeous country. It has exactly the same coast as California, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, with all of the shopping malls and highways removed.
but more humidity. It sounded like a much hotter place, much more humid place than California to me.
It's more humid, but then you go to the beach, you go to the mountains. Yes, there's jungle in Vietnam. So anyway, the gambit for writing The Spy Who Loved Us was as follows. Pham Son Ann's life. He's born in 1927, comes of age in the Second World War, is a young student during the First Indochina War, comes to the United States, is a correspondent for Time magazine during the Second Indochina War, and then sees Vietnam in the post-war years. So his life, just by telling the story of his life alone, with all of its anecdotes and jokes and stories, you get the entire span of Vietnamese history in the 20th century.
It's a very comprehensive book that way, and I actually was going to kind of end the interview with that, just talking about the history. Yeah, it's very, very well done in that regard, because there is so much history. I mean, you said 5,000 years, so you kind of, I mean, the book is only 263 pages, other than, excluding the acknowledgments and the forward and so forth, that you were able to put so much of that, weave that into his story. It's really remarkable, and it's very interesting. And I wanted to ask you, how did you describe in great detail how he got his information to the communists, and I thought that would be something good for you to share, like the spy stuff, the fun stuff, the secret ink and the rice paper, and wrapping it in the spring rolls, and which I love to eat. So I'll never eat another spring roll without thinking about this could be a spy weapon kind of thing, So if you could just share with us what he did. Okay, he worked as a reporter during the day, and then at night he went home to his family. He had 4 children, right, and a loving wife. And then they all went to bed, and then what did he do?
Yeah, well, he was the hardest working, Pham Son Ann was the hardest working man in Vietnam, as far as I can tell. He worked nonstop as a journalist for Time, and then would go home at night and do his second job. And the second job consisted of making up some secret ink, which apparently all you do is take some rice and get some cornstarch, heat up the rice, and make some cornstarch, and use a quill pen, and take some coarse brown wrapping paper.
Like cement paper, wasn't it?
He called it cement paper.
Like the big heavy paper, right?
Heavy wrapping paper. And you take this secret ink, you need a very bright light. So here it is, it's midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. He has an intensely bright light. And of course, his trusted German Shepherd is at his feet, because he had learned from Edward Lansdale, the great CIA agent, how to use dogs in intelligence work. Dogs intimidate people. They don't like to get near you when you have a dog. Dogs have very acute hearing. They can hear when the police are in the neighborhood. Dogs give you signals. Pham Son Ann used to drive around in his car, and his dog would be in the passenger seat directly next to him, with ears perked, looking straight ahead. Anyway, so Pham Son Ann is writing, and the other thing about secret ink, it dries very rapidly, and you can't see it. You can only see it when you rub the piece of paper with iodine. So you have to memorize what you're going to write in advance, and you have to write very fast. And every night, he would, under a bright light, using secret ink in this coarse cement paper, write his dispatches. And he also would photograph documents. He'd set up a darkroom in his house. And it's these undeveloped rolls of film that would be then put in the spring rolls.
Okay.
And so he'd put the film in the spring rolls, then he'd wrap up the package in the cement paper, and then he'd make a little basket, the same kind of basket that you place on someone's grave when commemorating their death. And every morning he would take his German Shepherd for a walk at the racetrack, and he would leave his spring rolls and his messages in a tree, or stuffed or in the trunk of a tree, or up in the branches of a tree, or wherever his dead drop was located.
He had different drops, though.
He had different drops all over the city. And there were 56 intelligence agents who were devoted to running his messages out of Saigon into the countryside.
His couriers, yeah.
And a fair number of those, I forget the exact number, something like 25 or 26 were killed. Very dangerous work.
You talked to two of them, didn't you?
Yes,
The two women that I love when you said they were like two little old ladies sitting there thinking they're going to talk about bridge, and the two of them were spies in the jungle. I love that. I just got this great imagery when you put that together. And the one thing too with the film, that he would leave a little lead out, so if they did get caught, they would just take it and expose it right away, and they take them away, of course, but the film wouldn't get exposed, so they weren't able to get the information. So.
Well, yes, your job as a spy, if you were caught, was to pull the leader on the film and develop the film so that no one would know what had actually been filmed. You would, of course, be killed for doing that.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. Nerves of steel. You got to have. I couldn't do it. I'm not a journalist spy. I'm just a journalist. I just don't. I love spy stuff, but I just think those people are just. I mean, he did talk about that he would get really. I mean, he smoked a lot. Which is interesting. You said that he blames the Americans because they taught him how to inhale, that he was just puffing away on the cigarettes. And if they just let him be, maybe he wouldn't have gotten, collapsed lungs and all his lung problems. So he blamed the Americans for that, which I thought was funny.
But that was a joke.
Yes, absolutely. No, it was just funny. It was certainly his own doing. But very frail person, very thin, that he was very wiry, which, is the, Asian people are certainly better, healthier than we are. But he must have just been so keyed up all the time. I mean, having to maintain those two, well, more than the two lives, but all these different people that he was giving information to. So, yeah. Speaking of why do you think he survived?
He survived for 30 years as a spy, expecting every day to die, expecting every day to be discovered and killed, because he knew full well what happened to spies. That's the thing about spies are remarkably useful and sometimes remarkably effective. But you meet a rapid and sudden death if you are revealed for being a spy. It's exceedingly dangerous work. And you get no respect either.
Well, they don't want to know you once you get in there because they want to disassociate. So you're almost like dying for no reason. But you say rapid death. I think it's more a slow death because you talk about that a lot, especially toward the end of the book when you go to some of the notorious prisons in Vietnam and just the brutality, on all sides. The people inflict on each other to get information from people, and what people are not willing to give up or willing to give up, and who they sell out. I mean, it's just, it continues to this day, and it will always continue as long as we have conflict. People want to know what's going on.
Well, Holly, if I can interject something,
sure.
The other gambit in writing The Spy Who Loved Us, writing this book, was that the Vietnam War is still with us. This is not history. This is our legacy, and we're still living it. So the entire torture debate that the United States is now engaged in, these practices and this entire debate stems from the Vietnam War. Stems from the Korean War. Stems from the Second World War. But torture was widely used during the Vietnam War, and Halliburton was involved in building the tiger cages, the famous torture cells on Condau Island. So you even have the very same players carrying on from the Vietnam War right up to Guantanamo and Iraq. So there certainly is a continuity from our experience in Vietnam right up to the present day, right up to our current debates about torture and the torture memos and which practices are to be used or not used.
Right. Waterboarding, is it really?
Waterboarding, yes.
Yeah, in particular.
Widely practiced during the Vietnam War.
The one thing, too, is interesting because I had just learned this myself, but that the fact that the CIA really used journalists as spies during the Cold War was very common, very, very common. And even the Henry Luce, who ran Time, had a whole mentality there that this is, we are writing for our government and our cause, and which just certainly stares in the face of objective journalism. We're not supposed to have a side. We're not supposed to be perpetuating a cause. We're just writing the facts, and we know in the business that that's people take sides. We're human beings, and things happen, and so forth. So, wanted to ask you why didn't On write his own memoir? Everyone's writing about On. You've written about him. Other people have written about him. You raised an interesting point in the Quiet American, the guy who actually kills Alden Pyle is loosely based. It's a, which I hate when Hollywood does this. They just lump all these people together and we'll make him the bad guy. And it was so interesting to me that, because he was the top spy, but at the same time, and he also was a consultant on the film. But why didn't he write his own memoir?
Well, this gets back to your question about why did I want to abandon this project? As juicy and as this story is, and how incredibly exciting. Famsonan was not telling me everything about his life. Mm-hmm. And in fact, after the New Yorker article appeared, he broke off relations with me. We spent one more long night talking long into the night, and then he said he would never see me again. Mm-hmm. I thought this was someone who was a friend. I thought we had developed a close relationship over many years. I eventually realized, or people told me, that he had received orders. He was under direction not to talk to me further. Mm-hmm. He was still working as a military intelligence agent. And he had received permission, apparently, to talk to me for a magazine article, but not for a book.
Too much information.
Too much information. And so, to this day, this is one of many books written about Famsonan. The Vietnamese have written 3 books about Famsonan. Mm-hmm. They made a 16-part TV series about Famsonan. There's a book that's appeared in France. There's another book that appeared before my book appeared in English. Mm-hmm. So this guy, Famsonan, clearly ranks as one of the great spies of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And his life as a spy is so long and so rich, and he was so reticent and took so many secrets to the grave with him that writing this story is not easy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was just in Hanoi last May trying to get access to the military intelligence archives where those messages, those secret messages and his dispatches are shelved.
Oh, they have them?
They have them, of course they have.
They have his car in the museum, which I thought was
yes,
funny.
there's a military intelligence museum.
And his car is up on blocks, you said.
His car is in the museum. His camera's in the museum.
Camera, okay.
And one of his suits.
That's right.
One of the 4 suits that he took to study at Orange Coast College is in the museum. I could not even get permission to visit the museum.
Yeah, I bet it's a fascinating place. So, but the fact that they still have the things that he was sending, that you think they would destroy that, like all the evidence would be just burned or whatever, or eaten or something.
Yes, they still have it. So I could not even see his suit, much less his secret dispatches. So that's going to be the next book on Famsonan.
Ah, okay. So there is another.
Well, maybe not mine.
Yeah, someone else. Okay, I see.
Someone else's.
I wanted to ask you, your book provides great history about who fought in Vietnam, the Japanese, the French, the Americans, the Chinese, the Cambodians. You say the country, and as we know, the country has moved somewhat from communism to consumerism, kind of a little mishmash. What do you think its future holds, and do you think On would be happy with what Vietnam is becoming? Knowing that you spent some time with him, he had such a love for his country. He obviously gave so much for 30 years. Would he be happy with the product? I mean, granted, he only died 3 years ago, but the way it's moving, I mean, it's changed a lot in 3 years.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and indeed, and maybe even a sensitive and delicate question, because Vietnam is a one-party Marxist communist police state. And when I say that to my students at the university, they look at me like I'm describing Guantanamo Bay or a very serious Nazi Germany or something like that. Now, Vietnam is a one-party Marxist communist police state, but at the same time, they often forget the rules. Or you can negotiate the rules, or the sun is shining and you smile, Or you take the spy who's assigned to you out to dinner and have a wonderful conversation long into the night. Everything can be negotiated. And unfortunately, a lot can be negotiated by means of money. Corruption is a big problem.
Like it was
in Vietnam.
back when the Americans were there with
Yes.
Diem and his regime.
Yeah. So Pham Son he used to get extremely upset about the degree of corruption in Vietnam. That was something that upset him greatly. He also tended to get very upset about the degree of influence that the Chinese have over Vietnam. The Chinese, the Vietnamese have fought many wars against the Chinese. The Chinese occupied Vietnam for as long as 1,000 years. And there's still some Vietnamese territory that is currently occupied by the Chinese, the Spratly Islands. And so Pham Son was, at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, there's a description in the book of a kind of smile, a kind of ecstatic pleasure that was hovering around his face when he saw the end of that war. 30 years of fighting, and his side finally won the war. And that must have been a moment of exquisite pleasure for him, that his cause had finally prevailed. And so I think he was pleased by that, but at the same time he was disappointed because Vietnam, post-war Vietnam, made a lot of stupid mistakes, really dumb things. They tried to nationalize the rice markets. They threw out the Chinese. They threw hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese into prison camps.
Including himself. He was re-educated.
Yes, Pham Son himself had to be re-educated for a year.
So they spent too much time with the enemy. So
Yeah.
they were afraid he was too
Yeah.
corrupted.
So the Vietnamese made many mistakes, and he was sorry for those mistakes.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Have a good week.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.